I'm really excited today to talk about a very timely topic about how do we as enablers keep our jobs, right? In the times we're in, the waters are choppy, and we're all feeling some pressure at times to keep our jobs because the market's not great, and we want to make sure we stay where we are happy. And I wanted to go really deep on this topic because I think oftentimes we don't know how these decisions are made. We don't know the things that go into who stays and who goes. And I feel like there's some really good lessons in that I wanted to explore. So for this, I called an old friend who I feel is an expert on this topic, Stacey Justice, who's here. And I've known her for many years now. I've called her in particular because over the years, she's been in some very senior enablement roles and she's seen a lot. We'll get into that in a minute. But as part of that, she's, as the old quote says, she's been in the room where it happens. She's been part of the conversations when people have to make tough decisions on who stays and who goes. And so, Stacey, maybe introduce yourself and tell people who don't know you who you are and a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, happy to. And it's great to be here. I'm happy to have this conversation with you, Dave. So my name's Stacey. I'm currently the VP of Go-to-Market Enablement for Gong. I have been in an executive leadership role, let's say in enablement for about over 10 years now. And I've always really focused on like high growth teams that are starting to kind of build scalable programs or where scale becomes critical. So I kind of like to join companies that are beyond that like $100 million phase where they're saying, how do we start to do this more repetitively? How do we start to build more scale? How do we start to build more process into our program? So that's kind of where I've focused, always with an eye on, how do we drive value? How do we be adaptable? And also, how do we drive productivity?
Very cool. So, with all those years in the saddle, just for context for people, what kinds of macro trends and cycles have you been through over the past decade or so?
Yeah. Well, I love this question because it's going to talk about how long I've been in the industry. But I'll tell you something. I think, I've been through a number of business cycles. I'll even go back to like 9/11, and I wasn't working in enablement proper at the time, but I was working in communications. I was working in marketing. So can go back and talk about 9/11, the 2008 financial crisis, COVID, which, I know a lot of people have been through most recently. Also the wave of tech downsizing that came post COVID. So lots of that and lots of ups and downs. I think each one of those has been a little bit different, but there's some similarities in that it's, companies are trying to drive to revenue, they're trying to drive to value, and they're trying to be smart with their resources. And I think, you can point to different reasons for each of those different downturns, but the economy is cyclical, all of that happens. And so keeping an eye on that is really important.
Yeah, and I agree. And in case it's not obvious, the things we're going to get into about, how do you keep your job? These are universal things, right? Things that are always, they're evergreen. They're always going to be things you're going to want to think about and do, but they are more acute when we're on the cycles of, a bust or a contraction or whatever you want to call it. That becomes even more important then. And so, but I think again, the things I hope that we get into today are things that we'll all take forward when in the good times and in the bad. So know that. So I guess we were talking just for a second about like some cycles you've been through. Maybe just from your vantage point there at Gong, what are you seeing now in terms of just the market?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think post the tech downsizing, which I'll kind of focus on, I think companies have been really trying to be a lot smarter about their resources. Pre-COVID, post-COVID, folks were hiring, right? If you had to get more revenue, you hired more reps. If they were only producing 20%, it didn't matter. And then, you started to realize, wow, I've got way too many people, which led to that. And so what I've seen over the course of like, let's say the last 18 months, 24 months is really a focus on how do you continue to drive capacity and growth and productivity. I think that's come into a little bit of a swing for enablement professionals with a lot of accountability coming to RevOps, right? So RevOps is kind of, from my perspective, taking a bit of a lead in terms of owning budgets, in terms of owning the data, and in terms of really kind of driving those workflows because they're held accountable to overall capacity and growth. And so enablement's kind of, I think, from what I've seen, enablement's kind of said, oh, oh, wow, I don't have this seat anymore. I have to actually justify or kind of really get into the numbers to show the value that I'm delivering, even more than I ever thought I had to do. And I think that's just becoming, I think that's just because businesses are really tightening down, and I'm going to say becoming like smarter around how they use their resources. And so I've seen a little bit of a shift in that for enablement teams.
Yeah, and I think even the twist that AI puts on things too makes people feel like we can do more with less or the same, like we can sort of just try and eke out more from the same or even do the same with less for your people. I think all that goes into, people trying to optimize, which is what you're getting at.
100%. I mean, AI is a whole different animal, right? And we don't know where that's all going to take us in terms of what's happening. Um, I have talked to a number of customers lately who are saying, I think I'm going to look and see how much I can optimize using technology and making sure I'm using all my tech before I start hiring, right? So like there's that. And I've also heard this, AI won't take your job, but someone who knows AI will, right? Like there's that's all out there. So I don't know where AI is going to take us. I think it's incredibly important. It's mind-blowing in terms of how much it can do. And I actually think enablement has a really good opportunity in front of it to get in front of the trend.
Yeah, and I think that's a whole separate webinar at
Completely
some point.
separate. I could spend hours on it.
I
I
could
won't.
too.
I won't right now, but I do think it's important.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah.
So I want to, we've touched on this, or you touched on this at a superficial level. I want to go much deeper on it. So, okay, it's 2025. Times are tough. People don't have the budgets, the headcount, and maybe some CFO, CEOs turning to their CRO and saying, all right, Dave, we got to tighten our belts. So we're going to have to lop off our biggest costs, and that's salaries, that's compensation. So make some hard choices. Go. As one who's been in those rooms and had those conversations and heard how they think about those things, go really deep on how do they think about that? How do they think about sellers versus enabling people, senior versus junior? Like, how do they approach that decision?
So it's a great question. And I'll tell you, so from my experience, first, I will say they're not sitting there saying, go after enablement. What they're saying and what they're looking at is how do we get to be more efficient? How do we retain our top talent? So, how do we keep these people? They're not like, how do we keep the people who are producing for us? How do we keep our customers, right? Because customer retention is the cheapest form of revenue, right? If you can continue to upsell that. And then where do we cut, which has the least risk to revenue? Like that's what they're thinking about,
Yeah.
right? They're saying, how do we maintain that? So in my experience, when I've gone through this, every headcount, every initiative is kind of looked at from a return perspective, from a value perspective, from impact. And that's why enablement always hears you've got to go to the numbers, you got to know to the numbers. But it's literally how are you impacting revenue, right? Because if companies are getting to a point where they have to cut budgets and they have to cut things, they're going to keep the folks and keep the teams that are driving them towards revenue growth. And so that's where I think it becomes so important for enablement professionals to be able to track to those key business metrics, the metrics that matter to the business, right? I have a big philosophy that I don't create my own metrics, right? I align to like what the business cares about. If we care about win rate, then I'm going to tie my programs to win rate, right? Because I want to help to drive the numbers that we're looking at every single quarter.
Yeah.
And so when leaders are in these rooms, they're looking at things and saying, what programs aren't working? Where do we have the most people who might not be driving revenue? And I think that's where enablement kind of gets caught in the shuffle sometimes.
And I want to pull that thread for a moment. I feel like there's sort of two parts to that. One is the projects that you're working on,
Mhm.
and do they or do they not drive towards the key metrics as you're speaking about? But secondarily, I think there's another thing of how do you let it be known what you're working on and how you're impacting those things, your own marketing, because again, if if I do great work in a vacuum and no one knows about it, does it really matter? And so I feel like there's sort of two parts of like what you do and those letting it be known what you do. Can you speak to either of those or both of those?
Yeah. So I think there's an important part there for leaders who are leading enablement and for ICs. I'm going to say first and foremost, I come from a marketing background. So I spent a lot of time in product marketing. I spent a lot of time in demand gen, but I have a marketing background. And so for me, how are you marketing your programs? How do you market yourself? How do you market your team from a leadership perspective? How do you market your programs? And that's like ensuring that people know what you're doing. Right. So from a leadership side, I think it's ensuring that you're quantifying the impact, you're communicating that regularly, you're staying close to revenue leaders so that they understand that impact, right? It's hard for an executive to go out and say, "Hey, I'm going to get rid of this person or this team," when the revenue leader is saying, "I couldn't do this without them." And I'm talking about like value-based programs, not like I not going out and like planning an event or something, but getting out there and really tying it to the business metrics that matter
Yeah.
and showing that, hey, this program that we ran around discovery is impacting our conversion rates from stage 2 to 3 to 4, which is driving this win rate. Like you got to get into that level of detail. I also think you got to get into like operational side of this. So I mentioned kind of enablement moving over into ops, but you got to understand that tech stack. You've got to help drive adoption of the tech stack because remember, that's another investment that companies are making. And I think enablement has a key role in that. So I think you have to do that. If you're an IC, you got to, and I, this is for everyone, but I'll talk about ICs here. You got to show up 110% every day, meaning you got to lean in, you got to make your work visible. You have to understand and kind of dig in to understand the business value of it. Um, you got to be the person who will jump in and say, "Hey, I'll do that," when there's something that's like, I've got to, like, there's a gap there. Be willing to like take on more, be willing to kind of take on some cross-functional work
Yep.
if you can. And be curious about that. Like I think I don't think, and I'll say this, I don't think it's the case anywhere, but I don't think it's enough for someone just to show up. I think you got to show up and you got to be willing to jump in and do a lot of different things and make sure people know what you're doing.
I could not agree more. And I feel like the thing I always push people on when I hear them getting focused on what they did and not the impact, what they did was asking the question, so what? Why does this matter? And again, if that so what isn't the business metrics you mentioned a couple minutes ago, is I'm not sure you're working on the right stuff or it doesn't really matter, or you haven't really made that connection. And in my experience as one who talks to a lot of revenue leaders, a lot of enablement people, a lot of folks struggle to make that connection between what I'm doing and why it matters.
Yeah.
And I would contend, and I will contend to my dying day, it's really important that you figure that out too, because when you're on a Zoom, you bump into an executive at a PBR or whatever, and you can't speak to why the project you're working on matters, that's a problem. So it may matter, but if no one knows it matters, you're not doing yourself any good. And so really it's important for you to understand contextualize what you're working on. And that's part of how you talk about what you're working on is that you're tied to these very important things. And if you don't understand the so what, you're at a very big disadvantage.
100%. Over my career, I've had a lot of opportunities like for, to promote people, to hire people, different things like that. And I can tell you that being busy, being super busy doesn't translate into a promotion. And it doesn't it literally has to come down to how are you benefiting the business? What value are you adding? How are you driving the KPIs? And I think, again, I'll go back to that swing from where enablement used to be a lot more autonomous to where it is now. It's even more important to understand that impact.
Yeah, I feel one's brand should be the following, where if somebody turned to your CRO, Stacey, and said, "Hey, times are tough. We got to get rid of Stacey." Your brand should be such that your CRO says, "Are you nuts? I would be dead without her. I can't do my job without her. And no way, can't happen. We're screwed. We're going to be hurting ourselves." I think like that's the brand, right? Like I can't do this without her. No way, don't touch.
Yeah.
And easier said than done, but I feel like that's almost like the North Star of, do you feel that essential? Do you feel like they would go to bat for me because they're screwed without me? That's kind of the way it should feel when you're at 110%.
100%. I also think I also think so. I have said this many times on many public venues, but my least favorite word in the dictionary is enablement
Mm.
because it can be defined in so many different ways and every company looks different at it. But I think one area that enablement professionals have an opportunity to really thrive in, and really make a name is and take advantage of the fact that this word enablement is so broad is by being a true problem solver. And I think that's what gets into your conversation. Like if you've got the CRO and they're like, no way am I going to let that person go, it's likely that that person is leaning in, going above and beyond, and solving problems
Yeah.
that are helping and kind of driving an impact, right? And I think that's when someone becomes incredibly critical to the overall organization.
Yeah. I, as a shameless plug on the Enablematch website, I have a video I recorded a year or two ago, and it's about how to tell your enablement stories, meaning how do you talk about the things you're working on and construct those stories, those examples in such a way that they're very compelling. And so if you haven't seen that yet and you're working on your stories for interviewing internally or externally, check it out. There's some really good nuggets in there about getting those things right. But I bring that up because it's all about the messaging. How do you message what you've done? How do you market what you've done? And again, you got to make sure people see you in the way that represents the quality of the work that you're doing. And so I think you being a marketer brings a nice perspective to that.
Yeah, 100%. And I also think there's a difference. So enablement's kind of an interesting area too, where you find that you've got either like enablement teams that are really small, or you've got enablement teams that are pretty big. And you like look at the larger like tech companies or whatever that have that. I actually think each of them requires a little bit of a different skill set to be able to market what you're doing. Because when you're in a small, let's say a 1 to 2, even 3 person enablement team, you're kind of required to be like, person who can do all sorts of things. Like almost like a Swiss Army knife,
Yeah.
right? You've got lots of things, you've got lots of opportunity to jump into different places, bounce around, do that. That's a fun place to be, but it's also a different story to take, right? You still have to understand that value. Now you've got this breadth of like doing everything. When you're in larger orgs, some people can think that it's actually more difficult. Let's say you're in a 20-person org, you have to differentiate yourself a bit from the rest of the team, right? You still have to lean in. And I actually think a lot of that comes into like leaning in and helping drive change management initiatives, for example, help show that you're able to kind of influence and impact. Maybe it's the teams you support or the programs you support, and you're doing it faster or whatever. But you have to find a way to kind of align to the overall goals of that organization. Maybe it's of that team, maybe it's of that like function. And you have to do it a little differently when you're in a bigger team. To be honest, you don't have the flexibility to jump into different swim lanes, for example.
Yeah, you make a nice point about working on big projects and working cross-functionally. And I'll tell the story back when I was an enabler a million years ago. My company was a software company, and we had like their next big thing was this product launch, and
Mhm.
it was like that was the pivot of the company, and I was an enablement person who was on that, and it was I was working very cross-functionally with all these different the product people and the marketing people and like it was everybody.
Mhm.
And during the course of that, the company had to have some. We were acquired, and then some tightening of the belt and layoffs happened. But I was good the whole time because I was tethered to the company's biggest launch that year, and so that gave me a sense of armor that I was like I could weather the storm because to get rid of me when they're trying to make this launch, I'm touching every facet of that launch. It was a good place to be, and so I think to your point, it's being tied to initiatives and the cross functional thing. It really I think helps market you, but also makes you seem like the most effective connective tissue out there.
I've also said I think enablement should be the most collaborative team in a company. Like enablement should, you're working with the sales team, you're working with like all of the revenue professionals based, across the go-to-market, you're working with product, you're working with marketing, you're working with ops, like the enablement in general, large or small teams, large or small companies, I do think that you have that opportunity to really get in there, really know folks, and really build those cross-functional relationships, which 100% adds value because it gives you visibility into what key initiatives are happening. It gives you visibility into those programs and where it's going to work. So I 100% agree with that.
All right. So let's do some detailed stuff here. So okay, we've covered a bit of ground. So I want to get really specific and tactical for a minute. So, what are some things that people can do to mitigate their risks of being let go? And maybe let's start if they're an enablement leader and they're
Yep.
trying to like keep their job, like what would you recommend to them uh, to be as essential as they can be?
So first and foremost, I would, quantify the impact of the programs that their teams are running, right? And help to drive that. So whether that's aligning the programs to pipeline, to ramp, to conversion rates, to overall productivity, right? Participation rate to me is a huge thing, especially in these times. Tie it to that. I mentioned earlier, stay close to revenue leaders. Like to me, that's really important. And I say that across all of them, like because the other thing that's happening is we're supporting all of a revenue function now. So staying close to those functions. Communicate, like over communicate. I would say it's one of my core values. Like have a communications background as well from a marketing comms. Like make sure people know what's happening. Like make sure that your value is seen and don't stop with all that. I also think, we've got this world where you've got people who are working completely remote and you've got people who are working in office. If you're working in office as a leader, take advantage of that. Get in front of people. I joke because I say I come in the office and spend 8 hours in a box. Don't do that. Like spend time with people. Set your schedule so that you're meeting with folks who might not even be on your team, but like build those relationships so that that will help foster your growth, but it'll also foster growth for your team. And then if you're not in the office, you've got to make sure that people know what you're doing. I think I have a hard time not being in an office personally. I think it's hard. I like to be in the middle of things. And so like, if you're not, then like, again, I think it comes down to communication, but also I think it puts more reliance on documenting what you're doing, right? Like if you are not in the office, there isn't water cooler talk, you're not able to like get in front of that executive or whatever, document it, share it, send it, make sure that's there. I think on the IC side, there's, obviously a whole host of different levels. I think first and foremost, you have to like get in and learn about the business outcome and the value that's there and be able to tie it to whatever you think is happening and make sure, like I talk to my team a lot about like, let's identify the business impact before the program starts, baseline it, and then track it through. And as you do communication afterwards, you're doing reinforcement, let's make sure it's tied to that. I think like that's really important for every single program that's happening. I
Yeah.
also think, especially if you're young in your career, take on other things. Like be that person that raises your hand, be the person that's willing to do things. Like I've got folks that stand out in my history and teams and things that who did that and they added so much value to the team and they added so much value to themselves. Like so I think that's a big thing. Be curious and like ask questions, get to know it. I also think that, a lot of times we talk a lot about enablement's got to be driven to value. If you don't know what that is, ask about it. Ask the questions before you start. Be curious and use that curiosity maybe with the leaders that you're supporting to understand what matters to them. So that you can start to like just continue to build that value and to continue to do it. Um, and I think, on the IC side, it's just as important to communicate. So I think, learning that, and building that. And then, I'll just tag this in, learn AI. I'm just gonna say, I don't know that you can have a conversation with anyone right now, Dave, and not talk about AI. So I just think that's important too.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. There's a bunch of things I want to unpack and follow-up questions I'm going to ask. So I'm because you said a bunch of things that I got my head spinning. So no, number one, I think the first thing you were mentioning was about metrics and
Mhm.
tracking them. So I don't want to have a whole rabbit hole discussion about metrics, but a lot of folks will say to me, we as a company struggled with the metrics from what we're doing. Ops didn't track stuff, or wasn't easy, or we didn't have stuff. You're probably in a luxury environment where things are tracked very, very effectively, that you have access to the data to do the tracking and analysis. If a person or people don't really have ops on their side or access to the metrics, like what's your guidance for them? Because that's a little bit trickier.
Yeah, and I will say I do sit in a situation today where I've got a lot of data at my fingertips, but I haven't always. right? Like I haven't been aligned with ops in certain roles and different things. And I think if that's the case, you still have to work to map it out. So, if you're running new hire onboarding programs, or you're doing something like, that's repeatable and programmatic and can tie to something, just track it, right? Like, get to know the systems, get to know in that. If you're not aligned with ops, then maybe like invest in understanding the data and understanding the systems that you've got there so that you can be more independent on it. I've been in situations where ops was way too busy to set up any integrations for us or whatever. So, we had to do it all on our own. And it's not impossible. You just have to be diligent. I think one of the biggest things is, set it up, test it in advance. Like if you're running onboarding, get down to if you can track activities that they're doing, if you can track certifications, that matters. And then track time. Like you can track time to first deal. You can
Yeah.
track second deal without ops there. Like you can do that. I think it's just a matter of being diligent and getting into the weeds with it.
And one of the things I talk about a lot with people is how enablement specifically is it's a relationship sport. And one's key to success oftentimes is their ability to deputize others to help them do things, whether it's marketing or ops or whoever. And I feel like this is one of the situations where the skill here, the advanced skill, is finding a buddy in ops, or somebody in ops, so you can say, hey, you guys have the data over there somewhere. Can you find me some way to get an export weekly? Or I don't have to have real time, but some things for I can kind of do my part of the puzzle. It's really important. And building that relationship to have an ask like that, I think it's one of those things because they have the data somewhere. Like Salesforce might be dirty and it might be tracked here, but somebody somewhere, they're running a business, so they're going to have the data somewhere. The question is, can somebody throw you a bone and give you access to some of the data? And again, it doesn't be real time, but something. And I think it goes back to just building those relationships. And the
Well,
last thing that I'm going to unpack that you said that I think is worth just touching on, it was this idea of, when you're remote. And I
right.
feel like there was a topic 5 years ago when we're all mid Zoom of like, how you're a manager during Zoom. What do you do with your teams? And there's all these things about best practices. And I think, one of the key takeaways that was true then and is still true today is if whether you're the leader or the IC and you're remote, intentionality is everything. And so you have to carve out time and with intention to build the relationships. So if you're the leader, don't hop on and go straight into the agenda. Like take a couple minutes, say, Stacey, how was your weekend? Or what'd you do with the kids? Or like whatever that is, like find ways for the humanizing moments to connect as a person, especially on one-on-ones. It's just essential because again, it's not about keeping your job as much as just building those relationships, which become foundational to everything else that you're trying to do.
100%. I think I've said that a million times, so we're in total agreement here, Dave. I think that it is about the relationships, but at the end of the day, you're in a job that you're not going to have forever, but these are humans that you can build relationships with. So there's that whole human element to it. And I think I've definitely grown over the course of that. We kind of laugh here at Gong. The enablement team is the team of icebreakers. So every single team meeting we have, we do a new icebreaker, and it helps us get to know each other and all of that. One thing I do want to circle back on, though, is the metric side of it. If you can get to a point where you're building that relationship and you're building a program and you start to like communicate the level of metrics you have, people will pay attention to that and it will open doors for you to get more metrics. Like if people know that you're serious about it, you're building the relationship, you're getting this weekly report, use that to your advantage to say, I could do even more, or we could show you even more impact if I could get XYZ. Right? Like that, once you start to show that that's going to happen, because I think a lot of times enablement's been kind of seen as the art, not the data side, and you got ops. You got to become both.
Yeah.
And if you show that you're focused on that, it'll open more doors to get more data.
And tying back to our topic for today, that that data is how you kind of fight for your job. It's how you justify and rationalize like why I have a job here. Look what we're doing with the team. We're driving these results. And again, that's how you make a case other than people like us and people call us. But no, we're driving the results. I think that is the ammo, the justification for why you're there, and maybe for whatever resources or headcount you might want to get. And so I think that's critical for messaging and justification. Like all that's essential, and you just got to do it.
Yeah, I agree. 100%.
Okay, so I want to ask another question. So, given where we are, things are in some places murkier than others, right? Situations, some companies are having layoffs, some ones are doing okay. A lot of uncertainty out there. Given where we are, this is a weird question. Are there opportunities in this for people? Are there things that where this could play to their advantage?
Yeah. So I mentioned problem solving before. I think that times like this present really big opportunities to jump in and solve problems.
Okay.
To jump in on change management, right? Like if companies are looking for different ways to approach or to find revenue growth, or they're implementing new programs in order to kind of maybe accelerate growth or accelerate pipeline, jump in and help with the change management. Maybe that's going out, like enablement being a one-to-many thing. Maybe that's stepping back from that and going in and like jumping in team by team and helping them to understand the why, helping them to understand what's in it for them, helping them to understand the tactics of how to get something done. But like helping them to better understand the workflow. But
Yep.
I think times like this offer an opportunity for enabling people to kind of be that glue that helps those teams get it and that helps those teams be more effective. And if people can do that, then I actually think those are the folks that shine in
Hmm.
these opportunities. Those are the folks that like you want to give bigger projects to. You want to give them more responsibility because you've seen that impact, or you've seen their initiative. In enablement, we talk will and skill around reps and how this is. That applies to enablement professionals too. You got to have the will. You got to show that that steps up. And to me, I think that's the opportunity that exists for enablement.
Yeah, and something you said before is ringing true as you're saying that. I think there are a lot of folks during this time, their reflex is to keep their head down. I want to just like stay under the radar. I don't want to be on a bad list. That's their instinct. And I think we're kind of saying the same thing of this is not the time to do that. Right? This is a time to stand up tall, to shine, to be proactive, and attach yourself to the most important things in the company. So while your instinct might be to be small and be safe, I think that is a myopic way of looking at one's safety.
I agree. And actually, I think enablement folks and professionals are used to looking at sales and kind of dissecting them. And I think you could take this as an analogy to like the seller who is 0% going into the third month of a quarter. That is not the time for that seller to kind of like step back. That's the time for them to like have no fear, right? Put it out there, drive faster, do more, like build on that and build on, and have confidence, because when sellers have more confidence, they're winning more, right? And I think I think enablement can take a lesson from that and say, if I just sit down with my head down, no one's going to notice me. They're not going to have impact. And they're going to say, well, I don't think there's a direct line to how we're actually driving revenue growth from this person. So do we really need them? And you might be one of the most valuable people on the team, like, but you're just not speaking up. So I there's an element of like stepping into that spotlight and having no fear about it. And it's contradictory to what you would say, I think, which is what you were calling out. But yeah, I think that's really important.
My favorite sales trainer ever. He was doing Sandler at the time. Is Guru Ganesh.
Guru Ganesh, I learned, oh my goodness, I'm a big Guru Ganesh fan.
So at Salesforce,
I've
we had
heard
him a few times, and he said something that has stuck with me for 15 plus years now, and it's more of a life mantra now. It's the following: the hard way is the easy way, and the easy way is the hard way.
Mhm.
And that applies to everything in your life. I teach it to my kids as well, but in the context of what we're saying here is when you're nervous, the easy thing is keep your head down, stay small, stay quiet, stay off the bad list, and do your thing. And then while that's easy in the short term, long term, it might get you fired. So life will get a lot harder in 6 months when you don't have a job. Versus the hard way now is to dive in head first, get involved, do all the hard work. That's the hard way. But ultimately, all of a sudden, good things are going to happen. That becomes the easier way longer term. And so I think back to Ganesh and say the harder way is the easy way, and the easy way is the hard way.
Love that. He was my first sales trainer ever. So big fan of Guru Ganesh. That's awesome.
Man, amazing, amazing, amazing.
Good work.
Okay, so one thing I just wanted to ask, just the enablement community itself is very special. And I feel like we're all by definition helpers. And so I guess just I'll ask this for you sort of very broadly. As people navigate these waters, whether the things are going well or not going well, anything you can think of in terms of how can they get help navigating all this stuff? Anything you can think of, or just things that you've seen people do?
Yeah, well, I will first and foremost, I will say if there's anything an enablement professional is good at, it's building community, right? I mean, look at the community that has formed around enablement in the last decade, right? It's huge. So I think it's a gift. I think I wouldn't take it for granted. I don't think other professions have a community as strong as what's been built by the enablement team professionals out there. I think leaning in, joining, these groups, joining the Sales and Enablement Collective, joining WISE, joining, getting involved in the revenue enablement side. I think that's important. I think I would do that. I also, lean on others. I think one of the things I've learned probably the most being at Gong actually is enablement professionals love to learn from each other.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to kind of like keep that network, lean out with them, share best practices, right? We're all looking for how do we optimize the work that we're doing? And so I think that's important. I think another thing, which could be a whole other topic, is find a mentor.
Mm.
Mentors have been incredibly important in my life, and they can be formal mentors, they can be informal mentors. But I think that's really important too. Like someone you trust, someone you can go to, someone you can bounce ideas off of. And I think that's really important too.
Yeah. On that last point, my suggestion is pick somebody who is, maybe two or three half steps ahead of you in their
Mhm.
career or on the ladder, just because you want to go where they're going in theory, and they'll have maybe some more perspective and more experiences that you don't have. You and a peer is fine. That's good for some things, but I think if it's for true mentorship, look up a little bit higher and find somebody who's been there who can help get you where they are. But I think
That
it's
might be the difference. Yeah. And that might be the difference between building a network and
right.
getting a mentor, right? Networks are important too. I actually always say like the people that you start with in your, early stages, they're going to be the VPs who are with you in your VPs. Build that network. They're just as important and, in terms of your career growth. And so, maybe it's both of those.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And as you said earlier, there's no shortage of people in our world who are willing to help you. And so you can go to any group and pick any one of them and raise your hand, say, "Hey, I'm looking for somebody to help me with this." I can promise you, you will get a bunch of folks responding saying, "I'm happy to. Let's grab a time." And so it's out there. Other thing I'll mention is the notion of a career coach. And
Mhm.
I did another expert series on this maybe a couple months ago with Whitney Seek, and you can find that on the website too. But if a career coach is more in line with what you need, that's out there too as an option. So there's all sorts of things to help you navigate those things. The career coach is good for accountability because they hold your feet to the fire on what you agreed you're going to
Yep.
do. And so it's a little bit different than the mentor or a peer or a network of peers. So lots of things, but I guess the bigger overarching message is you're not alone and you don't have to navigate this stuff by yourself. And so I think all of us are all here to help.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. Uh, Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I guess the one thing I'll ask of you as we close is, can you maybe, what's the one thing, if you just had to think back and reflect on the things we spoke about today, what's the most important thing you want people to take away from this in terms of keeping their jobs and staying safe?
So I think it's important for them to know fully that enablement has never been more important to businesses, especially in downturn, right? I think that's an important thing to remember to help to drive that confidence. But then you have to know that you have to earn your seat every day, right? So it goes back to the conversation that I said 110% show up, learn, build on yourself, know that you're important, stay close to revenue, show that you're doing that. And I think that's it. You're not alone in this. Like everyone is trying to kind of drive to value. And you are like your function is incredibly important to businesses right now. You just have to tell them how important it is.
I love it. Stacey, thank you for sharing all this stuff. I clearly I called the right person for this discussion, so I appreciate the time and the wisdom that was shared. And everybody out there, if you have any questions, let me know. But thank you for watching and listening, and good luck out there.
Happy to be here. Thank you so much.